1949, the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, the absolute highest honor in science. And it was awarded to a man who invented a procedure that literally involved drilling into the skull of a conscious human being and purposefully destroying perfectly healthy brain tissue.
40 to 50,000. That is the staggering, almost unbelievable number of patients worldwide who underwent this brain-severing operation before the medical community finally pulled the plug. So, how did tens of thousands of people end up under the knife, or rather, the ice pick?
Well, you really have to look at the sheer desperation of the era. We're talking about the time during the Great Depression and World War II. State mental hospitals were absolutely bursting at the seams. Their populations were just ballooning out of control. Doctors were looking at these severely overcrowded asylums, and they were desperate. They had basically no real treatments to help severely mentally ill patients who were, tragically, just being warehoused in these massive facilities.
But here's where it gets wild. The entire scientific foundation for severing human frontal lobes, it actually started with a single, highly anxious female chimpanzee. An American researcher, John Fulton, noticed that when this specific chimp had her frontal lobes destroyed, she suddenly became a lot calmer. It was like flipping a switch on her anxiety. And seeing this, a Portuguese neurologist named António Egas Moniz had an idea. He theorized that if you severed those same connections in a human brain, you might be able to instantly cure psychotic and depressive symptoms.
The procedure didn't stay a careful science experiment for long, though. It devolved, and fast. See, Moniz's original 1935 leucotomy was an actual, formal neurosurgery. You're in an operating room, drilling precise little holes in the skull. Enter Walter Freeman, an American doctor who was frankly just way too impatient for all that. He felt the traditional surgery was cumbersome. He became absolutely convinced that what America really needed was a quick fix, something that ordinary physicians could do right in their offices. No operating room, no anesthetist, and crucially, you didn't even need to be a surgeon.
Freeman's grand solution was, to put it mildly, shockingly violent. Here's how it went down. First, he'd knock the patient unconscious using electroshock. Next, he'd literally lift the patient's upper eyelid. Then, he'd take an instrument he invented called an orbital clast, which, by the way, he initially modeled after a literal ice pick he grabbed from his own kitchen drawer, and he'd tap it right through the thin bone at the top of the eye socket with a small mallet. Once it was in, he'd sweep it back and forth, completely severing the white matter of the frontal lobes. The whole thing, over in minutes.
And the cost for this quick-fix brain destruction? $25. That is all Freeman charged. It became dangerously accessible. He actually took his show on the road, driving across the country in a personal van he straight up called the Lobotomobile. No joke. He would travel from state hospital to state hospital, doing dozens of these operations in a single afternoon. Sometimes he'd even show off for the crowd by doing 2 ice pick lobotomies at the exact same time, one in each eye.
Now, hearing this today, you'd think there was massive public outrage, right? Actually, it was the exact opposite. Highly respected institutions were cheering him on. The New York Times literally printed that it was a miracle of brain surgery. Freeman was a master showman, and the media absolutely ate it up. Throughout the 40s and early 50s, this brutal procedure spread like wildfire, driven way more by Freeman's aggressive salesmanship than by any sort of cautious medical evidence.
And because it was so fast and cheap, the list of people targeted became horrifically broad. Sure, it was used on schizophrenics and severe depressives, but the net caught so many others. Troublesome adolescents, people with chronic anxiety, difficult wives, even homosexuals, since homosexuality was tragically classified as a disease back then. These were deeply marginalized people who were almost never in a position to give any kind of real informed consent. Usually, their totally exhausted, desperate families just signed off on it out of pure desperation.
The physical toll, as you can imagine, was immediate, and it was brutal. Right off the bat, the procedure carried a literal mortality rate of 2 to 5%. But honestly, for the massive chunk of patients who did survive the ice pick, their aftermath was often just as fatal to who they were as a person.
Surgically induced childhood. That deeply unsettling phrase wasn't from a critic. That was Walter Freeman's own proud description of his surviving patients. The surgery left them docile, practically vegetative, with their entire personalities totally flattened out. And the ultimate tragedy here is that Freeman didn't look at this medically induced childhood as a horrific failure. He actually viewed it as a massive clinical success.
There is no sadder example of this than Rosemary Kennedy. In 1941, the father of the future President John F. Kennedy arranged for his 23-year-old daughter, Rosemary, to have the procedure. Right in the middle of the operation, while she was wide awake, Freeman asked her to recite the Lord's Prayer and count backwards. He just kept blindly cutting into her brain tissue until her voice slurred and she simply stopped responding. The result was an absolute catastrophe. She was left permanently incapacitated, reduced to the mental capacity of a toddler, and hidden away from the public eye for decades.
But here is a really unexpected twist. You know who saw how unethical this was way before the Americans did? The Soviet Union. A full 4 years before US psychiatry even began to second-guess the ice pick, the Soviet Union straight up banned the lobotomy in 1950. They outlawed it on strict medical and ethical grounds, completely rejecting the practice.
The whole terrifying arc of this medical fad unfolded so fast. But ultimately, it wasn't some grand moral awakening that stopped the lobotomy in America. It was just a chemical breakthrough. In 1954, a daily pill called Thorazine hit the market. Suddenly, for the very first time, doctors could control severe psychiatric symptoms with medication. Almost overnight, shoving an ice pick into someone's brain became utterly obsolete.
Yet Walter Freeman just couldn't let it go. He stubbornly refused to stop. He became totally alienated from his own profession, but he kept right on driving that lobotomobile. He continued performing these operations all the way until 1967. It finally took a patient dying from a massive brain hemorrhage 3 days after his surgery for him to be permanently stripped of his operating privileges.
Freeman actually spent his final years tracking down his old patients, desperately trying to justify his career in self-serving books. The lobotomobile eventually rusted away, fading into the background of medical history, but it leaves this incredibly dark, haunting echo behind. What exactly happens when medicine, fueled by pure desperation and absolute certainty, manages to persuade itself of anything? And what happens when the irreversible damage of that certainty falls entirely on the people who have no voice to scream stop?